Hey everybody, it's Rabbit, welcome to the channel, and following up our Armored Core 6 review, today we're going to rate all of the fights in Armored Core 6, or more specifically, we're going to rate all of the major fights in the first two chapters, because there are a lot of fights in this game. Significantly, we're going to be doing both New Game Plus and New Game Plus Plus fights as well, so you might see some spoilers for stuff you maybe haven't experienced content-wise. In order to get to New Game Plus, once you finish the game, just keep playing, and make sure you take different routes than what you took previously, and of course take the new missions for New Game Plus. And if you do all of the missions through New Game Plus, you should then unlock New Game Plus Plus in your next playthrough. So a total of 3 playthroughs is needed to play basically all the missions. And if you're curious, we're going to briefly look at the 3 builds I used doing this, and also throughout the course of my playthrough. The first one is the Rabbit build, which is double Zimmermans and double Songbirds. This has gone through a few different weapon configurations, but it's always been a fairly light and aggressive build that gets up close and personal with some form of shotgun, and also has some kind of shoulder-mounted weapon to either harass or deal good damage. The second build is the Broadside. The Broadside has 2 shoulder-mounted plasma cannons and 2 arm-mounted plasma rifles. Earlier it had laser cannons on the shoulders before I got access to the plasma cannons, but overall it stayed pretty similar. It's a good long-range build, and because the plasmas have an area of effect when they impact, they're also pretty good at taking out adds as well. The last build is the Eagle. The Eagle is a missile spam build that is heavily based on Cinder Carla's build. It's a lot more mobile than Cinder's Carla, but it uses basically identical weapons, so that one you can't really access until you're in like New Game Plus mode, but overall I do think it's a very stout build for dealing with other ACs, as a lot of them can't dodge the constant barrage of missiles that you put out. And of course, if we're going to rate all of these, we have to go through a rating system. So for F tier, these are basically the how do you lose these fights. C tier, you could lose to them, but you probably won't. Even on your first playthrough, you'll probably get them on the first try, or you might die once just because you don't understand a mechanic or you aren't paying attention. B tier is the kind of middle of the road fights. They're threatening enough, but not so threatening that you need a ton of tries or any kind of specific kit to deal with. Then you have the A tier. A tier are generally difficult. It'll probably take you at least a few attempts on your first try, but once you get the hang of them, they're not too bad. And then you have S tier, which are the rage-inducing controller-throwing fights, where the enemies just have some stupid mechanic that's incredibly difficult to play around, and it might be a rage quit moment. And for our first fight, we might as well start with the tutorial boss, the Gunship. Personally, I put the Gunship at about an A tier. Now, there's a few interesting aspects of the Gunship. Number one, no matter what you do, you never get a customizable mech while doing this, and you also don't get access to any of your OS upgrades. And that makes the Gunship a unique boss because you never even get the benefits of like New Game Plusing against it. But then again, when you go into New Game Plus and New Game Plus Plus, they don't even make you play the tutorial. So it is kind of an odd boss, and additionally, while the game lets you as a new player get some basic facility with controls, it doesn't actually let you fight something where you need impact to stagger and then take advantage of that for the direct hit damage, which you actually do kind of need to do on the Gunship. Additionally, the only way you can stagger the Gunship is in melee, and the Gunship has a bad habit of flying outside the arena, so a new player might also get confused as to whether or not they're supposed to be meleeing the Gunship, and all of this combines for a fight that's just really tedious and annoying for a new player, as the Gunship is peppering you with damage and your main gun and missiles don't really seem to be doing all that much. That being said, once you get the hang of the game and you go back around and play the Gunship again, you're probably not going to lose to it, so it only makes an A tier, even though it did frustrate a lot of game reviewers apparently. And for our first AC on AC combat, we have the Tester AC. The Tester AC for me ranks as about a C tier. It looks threatening enough on the surface, it's reasonably aggressive, but it ultimately just doesn't have the weapons to really deal a ton of damage to you. So it's kind of a safe way for you as a player to see how AC versus AC combat works without necessarily having a real challenge put in front of you. So I really don't think the Tester AC ranks any higher than C tier. I think you can theoretically lose to it, but it's probably not going to happen that often. For our next one, we have Index Dunham, which is at the end of the Attack the Dam complex. You have both Volta and Iguazu helping you out for this, so this is basically a 3v1 curb stomping. This is an F tier engagement by every definition. It's not to say Index Dunham himself is that much of a pushover, but especially at this point in the game, but you have 2 other ACs helping you. So if you start to get too pressured, you can just pull back. You really shouldn't be losing to this fight at all. You have so much breathing room with the other 2 ACs. They're also contributing extra stagger, they're clearing adds for you. This is just not a difficult fight in any way, and on New Game Plus, you probably don't play this, but we'll see that in a minute, but on New Game Plus, this is not even close to being a challenge. Now, if you're doing the Attack the Dam complex in New Game Plus or higher, the Rubicon Liberation Front will actually call you after you hit the second facility and ask you if you want to kill Volta and Iguazu for them for a significant amount of money. And this means that instead of the final fight for this mission being a 3v1, it's now a 1v2. This is significantly harder than the Index Dunham fight. I would probably rate this at about a B tier. Now, the reason I rate this as a B tier instead of higher, even though you're going against 2 other ACs and both of them have the full 3 repair kits, which is pretty standard, the big thing here is that Iguazu is kind of a bitch, and he's also the faster of the 2. So it's very easy to like isolate or kite Iguazu while the relatively slow Volta can't really catch up. And then you can just deal with Volta on your own, and while he's got a lot of hit points and can hit pretty hard, he's not that complex of an opponent. So they managed to make about a B tier together. They are threatening, especially if you try to take on both of them at once. But once you get the hang of it and you have a good build for it, you can kind of take them apart pretty easily. And this is also going to start our Iguazu counter for these ratings, because you're going to see this asshole a lot and he never gets any harder to kill. Like, it's actually kind of sad how much he attacks you and how, like, impotent he is basically throughout the entire game. Next up, we have the Strider Battle. The Strider Battle is probably about a C tier. The only real difficulty in the Strider Battle is that the eye is relatively good at tracking, as are the missiles, so you do have to time your dodges for it. And also there is some risk of falling off the mining ship or just running out of your thrusters at the wrong moment. But I mean, that's really about the only challenge to this. It's very easy to just sit behind something, jump up, hit the eye, and sit back. The platforming isn't overly challenging, most of the enemies are pushovers. It makes a C tier, but that's about it. It's a pretty good spectacle and nothing else. Now in New Game Plus Plus, instead of getting a mission to destroy the Strider, you can actually take a mission to protect the Strider. Except the Strider is already dead when you get there, and there's a bunch of Coral Machines attacking you, and this mission is really obnoxious. The Coral Machines dodge pretty well, they move pretty fast, they're very aggressive, they fire a lot of missiles at you, and they're actually pretty resistant to a lot of ballistic weapons. This fight took me quite a few attempts. I would rate it as about an A tier fight. Like, you are probably going to have to change your kit to deal with this. This is pretty rough. And if you land on the ground too long, the spinning wheels will just grind you into mincemeat. So you almost need an airborne build because you're so vulnerable on the ground, you'll just get smashed. Overall, this is a New Game Plus Plus worthy fight, although not all of the New Game Plus Plus fights are anywhere near this intense. Next up, we have our first boss, and this is the Juggernaut. And the Juggernaut probably rates at about a C tier. The reason why the Juggernaut broadly rates as a C tier is because the Juggernaut doesn't have a lot of vertical targeting and is very vulnerable if you shoot it from behind. The only real points of frustration you might have with this fight is really that it's often kind of difficult to target things directly below you, and it's also kind of difficult to figure out exactly when you're quote-unquote behind the Juggernaut to actually hit it. But by and large, as long as you aren't playing a purely ground-based build, you should be fine to just fly circles around it, avoid the mines, and kill it. It's really not that tough of an opponent, and on repeat playthroughs, it offers basically no challenge. It's really only going to be on your first playthrough that you have any issues with it. Next up, we have a bit of a mini fight against Ziyi. This is in the Retrieve Combat Logs mission. Now, the interesting part about this is that this is your first, like, real AC versus AC fight, especially if this is your first playthrough, and it's not really that much of a fight. You encounter at a point in the mission where you're probably low enough on the timer that you can just run away and let it run down if you're in trouble. Additionally, it also kind of saves her from dying a lot, because if you are winning, you're probably not going to have enough time to kill her, especially with some of the early game builds and without a lot of the damage bonuses. So it's entirely possible that Ziyi does get away. Overall, yeah, it probably rates about a C tier. She is at least aggressive, and she could take you by surprise, but by and large, she's not really that much of a challenge. Next up, we have a New Game Plus encounter, and this is where you're trying to escort a Rubicon Liberation Front helicopter that picks up prisoners, and you happen to run into G2 Nile, and he offers basically no resistance whatsoever. You can see in the playback, we're just annihilating him with plasma cannons. He's not very fast, he doesn't do a ton of damage, he's not even that durable. He rates as about a C tier. He just doesn't offer that much resistance. The only way I could really see losing to him is if you got beat up in the rest of the mission, because there's no resupply point before you fight him. But at the end of the day, he is a very weak AC battle, and even having to protect the helicopter, I never found any real challenge. Next up, we have another New Game Plus encounter where you get sent to obstruct the inspection of the Baal's arsenal, and in this particular one you get ambushed at the end of it by a cataphract and 2 adds. Now you do have the help of Kate, or as I like to call her, definitely not All Mind. However, the 2 adds may give you a total of 3 different things you have to keep track of, and the 2 adds can very easily stagger you at inopportune times into the cataphract's damage. That being said, while this fight is kind of annoying and it's very easy to lose track of everything that's going on, it's not the most difficult in the world, so I'd probably label it as about a B tier. You're basically dealing with a mini boss and adds, but you have an add yourself. Next up, we have our first real AC versus AC battle, and this is Sula. Sula's reasonably mobile. He will basically dodge any attack that you telegraph. He's also pretty aggressive. He has a pulse cannon, missile launchers. He has a fairly good array of weapons, and he will go for things like melee attacks if he sees the opportunity. Sula's a pretty rough fight for a new player, especially if you haven't fully figured out what types of weapons are good for AC on AC combat, which you probably should be doing in the arena, but that's a whole other thing. Overall, I would give Sula's first appearance about an A tier. I think he's pretty difficult on your first playthrough, although he won't be much of a challenge on subsequent playthroughs, because you do have a very limited array of weapons in which to solve the problem that Sula presents. But of course, there's actually a second Sula fight if you're in New Game Plus. In New Game Plus, instead of fighting Sula by himself, there's actually 2 snipers behind you and also 2 snipers ahead of you that are invisible. Now, you might think this would raise this fight, because the previous Sula I gave an A tier, but the entire reason I gave him an A tier is because you run into him in the first chapter very early on in your first playthrough. This Sula is a New Game Plus. You've already played through the game twice, your mech is fully kitted, you have access to most of the weapons in the game, all of your OS upgrades are unlocked. You can kind of plow through Sula with no problems, and the adds are really not that difficult to deal with either. So unless your build is just heavily sub-optimized, this fight is kind of a nothing fight. So it actually only rates as a C tier. Most players, I imagine at this point, aren't really going to struggle dealing with this in their first encounter. And of course, we have our last Chapter 1 fight, the infamous run killer Balteus. Balteus easily ranks as an A tier. He's very difficult your first time through. He has a lot of interesting attacks. He's relatively mobile, although not crazy mobile, and he doesn't have a dedicated dodge. At the end of the day, Balteus does have some really exploitable behaviors. For example, the fact that he starts the fight basically stationary. If you have the assault armor, you can just run up, pop the assault armor, hit him with some shotguns, you'll basically stagger him right away and take off half of his health bar almost for free. So there's a lot of ways to exploit Balteus' behavior once you learn how the game works. But this is your first, real boss fight. This is the very first thing you'll run into that takes some actual thought and effort and attack pattern memorization to beat. And this is probably why most players, or at least a lot of the players that are having trouble with this boss. This is a pretty big spike in difficulty curve, and especially coming on the back of Sulla, even though you get an opportunity to reload between them, it's kind of a rough fight. So I would say he's comfortably an A tier. The only thing that keeps him from S tier is how much he kind of falls apart in subsequent playthroughs, because he does leave that massive early opening, and if you're coming back with a loadout like double Zimmermans, double Songbirds, you'll just absolutely melt half of his entire health bar before he even does anything to you. Next up, we have Invincible Rummy, which is an easy F tier. This is such a forgettable AC fight that I barely even remember it's there. The game doesn't even treat it as anything particularly special. You just unceremoniously kill him and move on, and nobody even comments on it. He doesn't move very fast, he doesn't hit very hard, he doesn't take that much damage. Just knock him out and move on with your life. So next up we have a pseudo-hidden boss, and this is Nozak. Nozak isn't actually hidden, but he's in a secret area that you can only get to by taking like a circuitous route, and he's also where a chest is, and he kind of just hides in a corner and ambushes you. This is probably about a B tier encounter. If you're a newer player, especially once you've come off the back of like Rummy and some of the other fights in this particular level, and you just get hit in the back of the head by Nozak, this can be a serious problem. If you're an experienced player, you know it coming. This is a nothing fight. Unlike a lot of other ACs, he doesn't have repair kits that he pops. He doesn't hit particularly hard. He is reasonably aggressive though. But yeah, it's really just a first run playthrough. If you run into him while you're not particularly well kitted, it can be a serious problem, but very unlikely to be that much of an issue if you run into him later. So he only really ranks a B tier, but is at least an interesting fight. Next up, we have the Cleaner, and the Cleaner is kind of a gimmick boss. So there are two main ways you can hurt it. Number one, you can just shoot it in the head. Number two, you can fly above it and shoot it down the main exhaust. And if you do have a flight build, the Cleaner basically has nothing for you. Occasionally it'll shoot out some molten lava out of the exhaust, and that's really about it. You can just pump shots into it all day. It basically can't even touch you. You can easily do a no-hit run on this boss if you have a flying build. So the Cleaner probably rates about a C tier. You might have some difficulty with it first time, and especially if you're obsessed with using like ground builds or something, then trying to hit it in the head without getting smashed by its melee attacks might be a problem. But honestly, just make a flying build, shoot the smokestacks with shotguns and whatever, and you'll probably be fine. It's really just a test of patience and nothing more. And for our next fight, we have a New Game Plus encounter. After Cinder Carla asks you to stop some hackers, you then discover a mysterious signal, and it turns out is the one and only Iguazu, Q Iguazu counter. Now, this fight is a little weird because after you get to the first few seconds of the fight, you then get interrupted by a bunch of stealth snipers and melee attackers, and Iguazu kind of agrees to not attack you while you both deal with them, and you should probably take him up on it because honestly they're a way bigger threat than he is. So you just casually deal with them and then you casually murder him. Overall, this fight is probably about a B tier. Getting surprised by the stealth guys is really the only major issue here. Iguazu is still kind of a bitch. And for our last enemy today, we have the Sea Spider. Sea Spider is a very interesting boss fight because the Sea Spider has one of the widest varieties of attacks of any boss, and it also doesn't have the easiest to read telegraphs of what it's doing with a given attack. And this doesn't combo particularly well with the fact that the Sea Spider has two different modes, the ground mode, and then when you get it below half health, the flying mode, both of which have completely different attack sets and completely different telegraphs. All of this makes it a really big challenge if you're a newer player, especially dealing with the more limited kit you're going to have this early on in the game. However, the Sea Spider, even before its nerf to its HP bar, really didn't present much of a challenge on repeat playthroughs, so it only really makes A tier. If it was more annoying to kill on a repeat playthrough, it would probably make an S tier boss, and if it hadn't had its health nerfed. But for now, I think A tier is a pretty good place to put it, and I know a lot of people have been having trouble with it. Yeah, it is just a difficult boss fight when you first encounter it. And that concludes our rankings for Chapter 1 and 2. If you disagreed with any of my rankings, feel free to let me know in the comments, but I think I got these pretty close at least. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope you found it fun and entertaining, and if you did, please leave a like and subscribe. Have a nice day, everybody!